I'm now going to do a brief review of the unit and also look at a past paper to look at the general expectations that you'll be facing as you prepare for the final exam. First of all, when we look at the unit, if we go down through the weeks, the modules, we can see it's made up of probably 3 or perhaps 4 different themes. Okay, we have the introduction, which talks about the importance of rural valuation. We have various aspects related to the rural circumstance in general, rural property in general. So we look at the land, for instance. We also, down at the end, look at vegetation, water, climate, and then we look at technology. We looked particularly at GIS in this case, but we can broaden that to look at technology systems, digital systems in general. So they're general topics, if you like, that pertain to understanding the rural situation. Then we have the valuation topics. We really did that, first of all, in week 3, where we introduced the idea of how to do a rural valuation, the particular requirements for inspection, and the general form of the report. Keeping in mind that the most important thing to learn about rural valuation is that rural property is a specialised income producing property. If you keep that in mind, you're already halfway there. Rural residential, hobby farms, and so on are hardly rural properties in the normal sense. The great majority is income producing specialist property. And we look at the way that Australian farming land is used. The products, food and fibre, come from plants and animals. We can talk about agriculture in week 5. We're also talking about agriculture in week 6 and 7, perhaps to a certain extent in week 8. Okay. What we're looking at is specialised ways to use land for economically productive production of food and fibre. Probably mainly food, but considering we produce cotton and wool and even timber, they are used for various purposes as fibre for clothing and housing. Okay, then we look at these various activities. We've got pastoral land uses, animals and so on. What are the peculiarities there? How many animals can you fit on your property? Important part of its income, because your income is coming from how many sheep or cattle you have on your property. Overwhelming majority of grazing land uses. We also talked about things like their supposed contribution to greenhouse gas production. Pastoral land use is very, very important because Australia, at least traditionally or historically, rode on the sheep's back. Also, we have beef as hugely important, but now under considerable threat for no other reason than the fact that these creatures eat grass. Okay, then we look at agriculture proper. Okay, we've looked at broadacre farming, the sugar industry. What are the peculiarities of sugar industry, say, compared to growing canola and mixed farming? Okay, look at that week so you're familiar with what a incoming sugar farmer might be looking at. And there we have things like the life cycle of sugarcane and so on, very, very important for sugar, and also the availability and transport facilities to the mills. Horticulture is for probably the most intense rural land use, and deserves attention, because if you go down to the supermarket, you'll see a surprising proportion of what we eat comes from the horticultural sector. Very important to understand. And again, the peculiarities, the importance of water, artificial environments in some cases, the intensity, and so on. What are you looking for when you're looking at a property for horticulture? When we look at other rural land uses, you see we can break these up in many different ways. What is the similarity and perhaps the difference if you're looking at orcharding or vineyards and so on? The similarity is that we're using plants to produce crops. The differences is each one of these has different markets, different life cycles, different particular requirements, and while some of those can be generally put down to soil requirements and climate, it goes a little bit deeper than that because you have, the life cycles of the plants involved. Okay, so what you can see there is a certain similarity between the different land uses. We could add more land uses to this. One that comes to mind is the poultry industry, especially considering the rising importance of chicken meat as part of our meat diet. Okay, so that's basically a thumbnail recap of what the unit involves. In the separate, I will now look at the past paper. How the unit translates into the exam. The exam takes its content from all through the course, and so we look at how that works. Overall, the scheme of the paper coming up will be similar to recent exams, perhaps with the exception of 2013. We'll talk about that separately. Parts A and Part B. When we look at Part A, what we're looking at is a case study question which is looking very closely at a particular rural land use. We mentioned sugarcane earlier, and what we're doing is giving you a case study scenario where you're considering what you would have to tell some new assistant in terms of what's involved. What are the fundamentals of the sugar industry, and what to look for when you do your inspection, so the value of the improvements, the significance of the improvements, the data to be collected, what information do you need, and lastly, trends in the industry. All four of those. There may be other issues that you may consider important, maybe the introduction of novel technology, digital, or at least GPS location of your individual animals, or greater monitoring of the contents of silos, clever implements on your tractors to perhaps make more efficient use of the chemistry that you're splashing about your property, and so on. So there are perhaps other topics as well. But really, when you break it down, while this is broken down into 4 parts to make it easier for you doing the exam, it's really telling us what is distinctive about the sugar industry that you as a valuer need to know, and how do you marshal those particular qualities to do your valuation. So it's an in-depth case study question. Now, out of the 50 marks in the exam, we've got 20 marks for this, and because it's specifying a particular land use, it could be any of the land uses that we've covered in class. And so you need to be able to apply this kind of depth to any of the land uses that we've covered through the unit. in order to get your 20 marks. If part A turns up in the coming exam with the cattle industry or horticulture or whatever, you need to be prepared for that. Okay, then we move to part B. Part B has options. Answer 3 of the following questions. So we have 5 questions. You only have to answer 3, so you get to pick your favourites. Okay, that's the important part here. Each of the questions only has half the marks of the part A question, so that half is important, but it's distributed across 3 of them, and so it represents about 60% of your exam is going to be in part B. Okay, and what do we cover here? Well, we've already looked at particular rural land uses up here in part A. Part A, by the way, could deal with some issues, water, climate, whatever, technology. And so here we've got the balance space to cover the other elements across the term. Okay, so here what do we see? Question 1, talking about water property. And if we look at that, we really see, when we're talking in terms of risks and opportunities and so on, and the valuation of water property, it really is an open opportunity to answer a 10-mark question with pretty much a comprehensive description of the significance of water property for the value of any particular rural property. Question 2, native vegetation. Now, this question is particularly relevant in an era where the protection of native vegetation is becoming more important, and that's largely a political or legislative question. We dealt with it in week 9 in the excuse me, in the unit. Again, how does the control of native vegetation affect the value of property? It can be seen also as a fairly general question. Question 3 talks about climate change and its relevance to rural property value. Okay, a general question in this case, could be more specific perhaps, but here you have a fairly open hand to looking at the question of climate change and its impact on rural value. As we're moving forward, perhaps with major changes to the grazing industry, but perhaps in other areas as well, things like the prospects of how could you make farm machinery battery operated, for instance, come to mind, and there will be others as well. And then we can tie this back to the very question of whether climate change is a scientific or merely some weird type of political event that human society is having to live through, is also extremely relevant in answering this question, and by no means an easy question to answer. Looking at question 4, okay, here we have another land use, again very general. Answer using example outline how a valuer might approach the valuation of broad acre grain produced. Basically, how might a valuer approach the valuation of, and then fill in a land use here. It could be almost any land use, because this gives you the opportunity to then outline your understanding of what's involved in this case, valuing a broad acre property. It could be an avocado farm, it could be irrigated cotton, or whatever. Simple question, tell us all you know, and there's 10 marks in there. Last one, looking at another land use, sheep station. Okay, again, similar format generally. Tell us all you know for a 10-mark question. One thing that I do want to come back to, which is fairly important, and that is time allocation through the exam, where suggesting here that about 140 minutes, that's about an hour and 20 minutes, will be quite adequate for tackling the exam. The recommendation is that you basically spend about 20 minutes for each 10 marks of the exam. That translates into 40 minutes for the 20 marks in Part A and about 20 minutes for each of the 3 questions in Part B. If you do that, you'll comfortably do adequate. In terms of preparation, I would recommend that you maybe do a trial run and see how much you can comfortably write in about 20 minutes. I'm not looking at pages and pages of answers as expectation for your solutions. I'm looking at, ideally, succinct answers to the questions. Whatever you do, do not try and use AI to answer the questions. It will necessarily look silly and bulky and pretty useless. If you use bullet points or succinct notes, especially, well, in fact, in all of the questions, then you'll find you'll end up with the most compact and effective answer. It'll take you less time to write, and it'll make more sense to me as I'm attempting to see the quality of what you understand as I mark it. With all of that said, I wish you all the very best. You've got the exam happening really sort of 2 weeks after the final week, week 12 this week, and so that should give you plenty of time to bone up on the various parts of the unit and prepare your answers. Use the past papers to get an idea, a feel for what the current question is going to be like, and you should have no problems as you go through it. Hope you've enjoyed the unit, and I hope you find that it has also opened up a bit more interest and optimism as far as including rural valuation in your future careers.